Millions of people believe Neuschwanstein is a real medieval fortress built for war and kings. But that's an illusion. This castle wasn't built in the Middle Ages at all. Construction only began in 1869, centuries after knights and fortified castles had already disappeared from Europe. No armies ever defended these walls. No battles were fought beneath its towers. In fact, this entire castle was built for something far stranger, the fantasy obsession of a king whose dream would end in mystery, madness, and death. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to The Medieval Heritage. High above the Bavarian Alps stands a castle that looks like it belongs in a fantasy movie. Towering white walls rise above forests and cliffs, surrounded by clouds and icy mountain air. At first glance, Neuschwanstein looks like a real medieval fortress built for kings and war. But that's the illusion. This castle was never built during the Middle Ages. Construction only began in 1869, centuries after knights and fortified castles had already disappeared from Europe. No armies defended these walls. No battles were fought here. So why was it built? Because Neuschwanstein was never meant to protect a kingdom. It was built to escape reality. The castle was created by Bavaria's King Ludwig II, a ruler obsessed with medieval legends, fantasy stories, and the operas of Richard Wagner. Ludwig wanted to create his own dream world high in the mountains, far away from politics and modern society.
But the deeper he disappeared into fantasy, the stranger his story became. Behind the fairy tale beauty of Neuschwanstein lies obsession, isolation, massive debt, and a mysterious death that historians still debate today. And once you learn the truth, this castle feels far less magical and far more haunting. King Ludwig II became ruler of Bavaria at only 18 years old. But unlike most kings, Ludwig had little interest in politics or war. He was quiet, introverted, and fascinated by myths, knights, and fantasy worlds. Then he discovered the operas of Richard Wagner. Wagner's stories were filled with swan knights, magical kingdoms, and tragic heroes. Ludwig became completely obsessed. Instead of focusing on ruling Bavaria, he dreamed of building a world inspired by these legends. In 1869, that dream became Neuschwanstein. The castle was built on a steep mountain near the ruins of older medieval forts. But Ludwig didn't restore those castles. He created an entirely new fantasy version of the Middle Ages. Everything about Neuschwanstein was theatrical. The towers, bridges, and dramatic mountain location were designed for beauty, not defense. From a distance, the castle almost looks unreal, and that was exactly what Ludwig wanted. He wasn't building a military fortress. He was building a fantasy. But here's the strange part. Although the castle looked medieval from the outside, hidden inside were technologies far ahead of their time. Step inside Neuschwanstein and suddenly the medieval illusion disappears, because hidden behind the ancient-looking walls was surprisingly modern technology. The castle had central heating, running water, flush toilets, and even telephone lines. Luxuries many European homes still didn't have in the late 1800s. It looked medieval, but functioned like a modern palace. And Ludwig's imagination didn't stop there. Inside the castle, workers built an artificial cave, complete with waterfalls, colored lighting, and hidden passageways. Imagine walking through royal halls only to suddenly enter a glowing underground grotto inspired by mythological stories. Why would a king build something like this? Because Ludwig wasn't creating a normal residence. He was creating emotional experiences inspired by Wagner's operas and Germanic legends. The castle became his private escape from reality. Servants were ordered to leave him alone for long periods. Entire halls remained empty because Ludwig preferred isolation over royal ceremonies. But while the fantasy world inside Neuschwanstein kept growing, problems outside the castle were becoming impossible to ignore. Construction costs exploded, debts piled up, and Bavarian officials slowly began asking a dangerous question. Was their king a visionary dreamer or a man losing touch with reality?
By the 1880s, Neuschwanstein had become a financial disaster. Ludwig II wasn't only building one castle, he was funding multiple extravagant palaces while borrowing enormous amounts of money. Government officials warned him repeatedly to stop spending, but Ludwig refused. Even worse, Neuschwanstein was still unfinished. Nearly 200 rooms had been planned, but only a small portion was completed. Huge sections remained covered in scaffolding and raw stone. Still, Ludwig kept ordering new decorations, paintings, and fantasy designs. This is where things get strange. In 1886, Bavarian officials declared Ludwig mentally insane and removed him from power. Some historians believe Ludwig truly suffered from mental illness. Others believe powerful politicians simply wanted to remove a king whose spending had become uncontrollable. Then came the mystery. Only days after losing his throne, Ludwig went for a walk near Lake Starnberg with his doctor.
Hours later, both men were found dead in shallow water. No one fully agrees on what happened. Officially, Ludwig died by suicide, but rumors of murder and political conspiracy spread almost immediately. And to this day, the death of the Fairytale King remains one of Europe's most famous unsolved mysteries. After Ludwig's death, something unexpected happened. The castle that nearly destroyed him became world famous. Only weeks after the king died, Neuschwanstein was opened to the public so Bavaria could recover money from the massive construction costs. Ironically, the private fantasy Ludwig built to escape society quickly became one of Europe's biggest tourist attractions, and the world fell in love with it. Photographs of the castle spread internationally. Artists painted it. Filmmakers admired it.
Eventually, Neuschwanstein even inspired Disney's Sleeping Beauty castle, turning Ludwig's dream into one of the most recognizable fantasy images on Earth. But beneath the magical appearance, traces of tragedy still remain. The castle was never fully completed. Some rooms feel strangely empty. The grand throne room was designed for a throne that was never installed. Even the location feels symbolic. Neuschwanstein sits isolated above forests and cliffs, far removed from cities and politics, almost as if Ludwig wanted to separate himself from the real world completely. Because behind the fairy tale beauty is the story of a lonely king trying to escape reality through imagination. Today, more than 1 million people visit Neuschwanstein every year. Tourists crowd the mountain bridges, searching for the perfect photograph of the real-life fairy tale castle. But most visitors never realize what they are truly looking at.
Neuschwanstein is not a monument to medieval history. It is a monument to escapism. Everything about the castle reflects Ludwig II's desire to retreat from the modern world. The dramatic towers, fantasy murals, artificial cave, and isolated mountain location all reveal the same thing. This castle was built for imagination, not reality. And perhaps that is why it still fascinates people today. Because Ludwig's story feels strangely timeless. A lonely ruler, overwhelmed by a changing world, created a fantasy so powerful that it outlived him. Ludwig died before Neuschwanstein was completed. He lost his throne, fell into debt, and became surrounded by mystery. Yet his impossible dream survived. What was once criticized as reckless fantasy eventually became one of the most iconic castles on Earth. A masterpiece born from obsession, a fantasy built on isolation, and a reminder that sometimes the most unforgettable monuments are created not for power or war, but for the human desire to escape reality.